I still remember the exact weight of the silence that had settled into our apartment after my mother died. It was the kind of silence that had texture to it, the kind you could press your hands against and feel pushing back. 6 months after Sarah Calloway closed her eyes for the last time in that hospital bed in Chicago, I had learned to move around that silence the way you learn to move around furniture in a dark room. Carefully, without disturbing anything, afraid that if I bumped into it too hard, something would shatter that could never be put back together. My name is Nora. I was 17 years old and I was surviving. Not living, not even close to living. Just surviving, which is a different thing entirely, and anyone who has lost someone they love more than air will understand exactly what I mean. I had learned to make coffee in the mornings without thinking about how my mother used to hum while the pot was brewing. I had learned to eat dinner at the kitchen table without looking at the chair where she used to sit. I had learned to sleep in a bedroom that still smelled faintly of her perfume if I pressed my face deep enough into the old pillowcase she had left on the chair by the window. I kept that pillowcase there. I kept it exactly there, and I had made it very clear to Garrett that no one was to move it under any circumstances. Garrett Calloway was my stepfather. He had married my mother 4 years before she died when I was 13, and skeptical of every adult who tried to insert themselves into the careful world my mother and I had built together. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because the story I am about to tell you is complicated, and the complicated parts come later. At the time in those gray months after we buried her, Garrett was simply a man trying to figure out what to do with a grieving teenager he had never fully understood when her mother was alive, and understood even less now that she was gone. We were orbiting each other in that apartment, two satellites locked in proximity by the gravity of shared loss, never quite making contact. That was the condition of my life on the morning of the phone call. It was a Tuesday in March, one of those March days in Chicago when the cold has been going on so long that you stop believing spring will ever actually come. The sky outside the apartment windows was the color of old concrete. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold while I stared at it, watching the clock on the microwave count off minutes that felt like they had no particular destination. Garrett was in the other room. I could hear the low murmur of his voice, and then I heard his tone change. Something shifted in the register of it from the flat, distracted quality of his usual phone manner to something tighter, more alert. I heard him say the word Montana, and something in my chest went still. He appeared in the kitchen doorway holding out the phone. "It's for you," he said, "a lawyer." I do not know why those two words hit me the way they did. A lawyer. Something about the combination of that word with Montana, a state I had never visited, a place I had no connection to, no reason to think about, no reason for anyone to be calling me from. I took the phone from Garrett's hand and pressed it against my ear and waited. The voice on the other end was careful, measured. The voice of a man who had delivered difficult news many times in his career and had developed a particular approach to it, a kind of deliberate steadiness, like someone carrying a full glass of water across a room. "Is this Nora Calloway, daughter of Sarah Calloway, formerly Sarah Aldridge?" "Yes," I said, and my own voice came out smaller than I intended. "My name is Harlan Nash. I'm an attorney in Millhaven, Montana. I'm calling about your grandmother, Dorothy Aldridge." He paused. In that pause, the world shifted under my feet in a way I had not expected. The way the ground shifts just slightly before an earthquake, that almost imperceptible tremor that tells you something enormous is about to happen. "I'm afraid she passed away 4 days ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. The funeral was yesterday. I apologize for not reaching you sooner, but finding your contact information took some time." Grandmother. The words sat in the middle of my mind like a stone dropped in still water, sending out rings that kept expanding outward until they touched the walls of everything I thought I knew about my own life. My mother had told me her parents died before I was born. Both of them. She said it the way people say things that are not up for discussion, with a finality that closes off all the hallways of follow-up questions before you can even find them. I had never pushed. I had never asked for names for stories for photographs. I had simply accepted it the way children accept the shape of their world, as though the edges of it are natural and inevitable rather than constructed by the choices of adults. "Nora," Harlan Nash's voice came through the phone. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I managed. "Your grandmother left everything to you. The house, the land, 80 acres in total. She named you specifically in her will, updated it just 3 months ago. She knew exactly who you were." He paused again, and something in his voice softened slightly. "She had been looking for you for a very long time." I stood in that kitchen for a long moment after the call ended. The microwave clock kept counting. The coffee in my mug was completely cold. Outside, the Chicago sky pressed down against the city like a lid on a box. Garrett was watching me from the doorway. "A grandmother," I said, "in Montana. My mother told me her parents died before I was born." Garrett's expression did something complicated, something I was too unsettled in that moment to read correctly, though I would come back to it later, turning it over in my mind like a stone you keep picking up because something about the weight of it is not quite right. "We should go," he said. "Handle the estate. It would be straightforward." He said the word straightforward the way people say it when they have already done the math in their heads and decided they like the answer. We drove to Millhaven 3 days later. I want to describe that drive to you because it matters, not for practical reasons. For the reasons that things matter when you are 17 and grieving, and you have just discovered that your entire understanding of your own family history was built on a foundation that someone deliberately chose not to show you. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change. Chicago fell away behind us, the steel and glass and density of it giving way to the flat arithmetic of the Midwest fields stretching out to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. And then gradually, the geometry of the land began to change. The flatness lifted and folded into itself, becoming something else entirely. Rolling hills appeared. Pine forests thickened on either side of the highway. And then finally mountains, their peaks still carrying the white of late-season snow against a sky that had turned out here a blue so deep it seemed to have weight. I watched all of this and said very little. Garrett drove and made occasional comments about property values and the logistics of an estate sale. I listened to the sound of his voice and thought about the word grandmother, about 80 acres, about a woman who had updated her will 3 months before she died to make sure I was in it, who had been looking for me for a very long time, according to a lawyer whose careful voice carried the particular weight of things that had been carefully protected. We turned off the interstate onto a 2-lane highway, then onto a county road, then onto a gravel path that wound through fields of tall grass moving in the wind like something breathing. And then I saw it. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long driveway lined on both sides by oak trees that had been growing there for longer than anyone still living could remember. It was a Victorian structure, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the afternoon light and held it. The white paint was peeling in places, curling away from the wood in long, slow strips. The porch sagged on the left side where something beneath it had given way. One of the upstairs windows was covered with boards that had weathered gray. But beneath all of that, beneath the slow, patient damage of years and weather and neglect, I could feel something in the bones of that house. Something that had not given in. Something that had decided a long time ago that it was going to keep standing, regardless of what the world chose to do to it. In the front yard, a massive willow tree had died. Nothing remained of it but a jagged stump, gray and weathered, rising from the earth like something that used to be beautiful and had decided to keep being present even after the beauty was gone. I stepped out of Garrett's car, and the silence hit me with a physical force I was not prepared for. No traffic, no construction, no neighbors, no city pressing in from every direction. Just wind moving through the tall grass, and somewhere far overhead, the distant cry of a hawk circling in that impossible blue sky. "Let's make this quick," Garrett said behind me. He was already looking at his phone. "The lawyer said he'd meet us here at 4. I was not listening. I was walking toward the house, my feet moving without any particular instruction from me, drawn by something I did not have a name for. Something that had nothing to do with logical thought or practical consideration. When I stepped onto the porch and the old boards shifted under my weight and groaned the way old wood groans, I felt something move through me from my feet upward. Something that felt impossibly like recognition. Like my body knew something my mind was still working to catch up with. Harlan Nash arrived at exactly 4 o'clock, driving a dusty pickup truck that looked older than he did. He was a compact man in his mid-60s, with careful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that suggested he had dressed for this meeting with a particular deliberateness. He shook my hand and studied my face for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You look like her," he said finally. Your mother. Same eyes, same set to your jaw. He gave me a heavy ring of old iron keys pointing out which unlocked which. The house, the equipment shed, the storm cellar. Everything's yours free and clear, except for property taxes, which are paid through the end of the year. What happened to her? I asked. My grandmother, why did she never contact us? Harlan's gaze moved past me briefly toward Garrett, who was standing by the car running numbers on his phone, and something shifted in his expression. Some decision being made. Dorothy was a careful woman, he said, lowering his voice. She had good reasons for everything she did. There are people in this town who wanted her land very badly, who had wanted it for decades. She was careful about who she trusted and how she moved through the world because of that. He looked at me directly. You should be careful too, starting right now. Before I could ask what he meant, a vehicle turned onto the gravel driveway. It was a black SUV, expensive and immaculate, its polished surface catching the afternoon light in a way that felt almost deliberate, almost like a performance of a certain kind of power. A man stepped out. He was tall, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair swept back from a face that had been trained over many years into an expression of confident warmth. His suit was the kind that comes from a tailor rather than a store. His shoes were clean despite the gravel. He moved across the yard with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has never had to rush for anything. You must be young Nora. He extended a hand and smiled, and the smile was wide and practiced and reached nowhere near his eyes. Vincent Harlow, I was a friend of your grandmother's. A business associate, you might say. I wanted to come personally to express my condolences. Dorothy was a fixture of this community. She'll be missed. He paused, looking at the house with an expression that was trying to be wistful and landing somewhere closer to appraisal. I also wanted to take the opportunity to make you an offer while you're here, and we can talk face to face. He produced a business card from his jacket pocket and held it out with two fingers. $350,000 cash for the property as is. You could sign papers today. Walk away tomorrow, never have to worry about maintaining an 80-year-old farmhouse in rural Montana from Chicago. I heard Garrett make a small sound behind me, heard him step closer. That's very generous, Garrett said. The girl and I were just discussing the practicalities of the estate. A clean sale would certainly... I need time, I said. Vincent Harlow's smile did not disappear, but for just a fraction of a second, something moved behind it. Something cold and quick, like a fish turning in dark water, visible for only a moment before it submerged again. Of course, he said smoothly. Take all the time you need, within reason. I have other interested parties, you understand. But for Dorothy's granddaughter, I can certainly be patient. He pressed the card into my hand. His grip was a beat too firm and lasted a beat too long. I'll be expecting your call. He walked back to his SUV. The engine started with a quietness that spoke of significant money. The vehicle moved back down the gravel drive and disappeared behind the oak trees, leaving a thin ribbon of dust hanging in the golden afternoon air. I looked at Harlan Nash. The old lawyer was watching the spot where the SUV had vanished, and his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. What aren't you telling me? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, Be careful, Nora. Your grandmother was one of the most careful people I have ever known. He looked at me, and behind the careful lawyer's composure, I saw something that looked very much like fear. And it still wasn't enough. He got in his truck and drove away without looking back. That night, Garrett fell asleep on the old sofa in the front room, still in his clothes, his phone resting on his chest. I moved through the house alone, a flashlight in one hand, trying to understand what I had walked into. The rooms were full of newspapers. That was the first thing. Stacks of them, floor to ceiling in some places, creating narrow pathways through an accumulation that at first glance looked like the territory of someone who had lost their grip on the ordinary management of life. But I stopped and I looked more carefully, because something was wrong with that explanation, and I have always been the kind of person who stops when something is wrong with an explanation. The papers were organized, not by date alone, though that was part of it. They were organized by subject, by connection. Articles about Harlow development circled in red pen, photographs of construction projects with handwritten notes in the margins, court documents folded into some editions, land records tucked between others. Maps annotated in a careful hand I did not yet know but would come to recognize. This was not the chaos of a deteriorating mind. This was research. This was evidence. This was the work of a woman who had spent years, possibly decades, building a case about something she knew and could not prove and refused to let go of. I stood in the middle of it and felt the hairs on my arms rise. I moved to the kitchen. On the wooden table, which was old and scarred and had clearly fed many generations of people before me, someone had set a single place, a plate, a knife and fork placed neatly on either side, a glass of water half full catching the moonlight through the window, as though Dorothy had been expecting company for dinner, as though she had set the table for a guest and simply run out of time before they arrived. And beside the plate, a piece of yellow paper. The writing on it was uneven, the letters shaking the hand that made them, clearly fighting against some tremor it could no longer fully control. But the words were perfectly legible. Don't drink the well water. I read it twice, 3 times. Standing in that kitchen with the smell of old wood and faded curtains and a life recently and abruptly ended all around me. Why would she warn me about well water? The house had modern plumbing. I had seen the faucet, the water heater. There was an old hand pump near the barn, the kind that drew from a well below the earth, but no one relied on those anymore. Why would a dying woman use her last remaining energy to write this particular warning and leave it where she knew I would find it? I was still holding the note when I heard the footsteps. They came from the floor directly above my head, heavy, deliberate. Moving across what I knew from the layout of the house was the master bedroom, the sound of someone walking slowly across old floorboards in the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs with a force that was almost painful. Garrett was on the sofa downstairs. I had checked on him 20 minutes ago. His breathing had been slow and even, the breathing of a man in genuine sleep. There was no one else in the house. There was no reason for anyone to be in the house. We had locked the doors. I had checked the locks myself. I set down the note, looked around the kitchen with the flashlight beam, found what I was looking for, hanging above the stove, a cast iron skillet, heavy and black, with decades of seasoning, the kind of pan that had cooked 1,000 meals and would outlast everyone in the house by centuries. I took it off the hook. The stairs were old, and they announced every step I took regardless of how carefully I placed my feet. Each creak rang out in the silence like something being broken. I climbed anyway, reached the landing. The door to the master bedroom was not quite closed, standing open, just enough to let a thin slice of moonlight escape into the dark hallway. I pushed it open with the hand holding the skillet. The room was empty. But the window was wide open, the lace curtains billowing inward in the cold night air, moving like the arms of something trying to reach into the room from outside. I crossed to the window and looked out. At the edge of the cornfield, perhaps 100 yards from the house, a figure stood in the moonlight. Dark coat, hood pulled up, face entirely invisible in the shadow beneath it. Still as a post, still as something that has been standing there for a long time and intends to keep standing there. And then as I watched, the figure raised one arm and pointed directly at me. Not a wave, not a greeting, a point. Slow and deliberate, extended fully toward me across that 100 yards of moonlit grass, holding that position long enough to make absolutely certain I understood that it was intentional, that it was a message. Then the figure lowered its arm, turned, and walked into the standing corn. The stalk swallowed it whole, closing behind it without a sound, as though the field itself had simply decided to take something back. I stood at the open window for a long time after the figure disappeared. My hands were shaking. The cold air coming through the window was sharp against my face, and I was grateful for it, grateful for the sensation of something real and physical, while everything else felt like it was dissolving into uncertainty. When I finally turned away from the window, my flashlight caught something I had missed when I entered the room. A floorboard, just to the right of the old iron bed frame. The edges of it were scratched, the wood around them marked with the recent tool work of someone who had pried it up and replaced it without any particular attempt to make the replacement invisible. Someone who had either been in a hurry or had not expected anyone to look. I set down the skillet, knelt on the floor, worked my fingers into the gap at the edge of the board and pulled. It came up easily. Beneath it, in the old insulation between the floor joists, someone had placed a velvet jewelry box. The fabric was worn smooth by years of handling, faded from what might have been deep blue to a dusty gray. I picked it up. It was light, It had the weight of something precious rather than something heavy. I opened it. Inside was a key, not the modern cut metal kind that opens deadbolts and padlocks. An old iron key heavy for its size, the kind made when things were made to last centuries rather than decades. Wrapped around the bow of it, the loop at the top was a strip of masking tape. On the tape, written in tiny, precise letters that showed no tremor at all, as though this had been written at a time when Dorothy's hands were steadier, and the stakes of the message made absolute precision necessary were two sets of numbers. Coordinates, latitude and longitude. Beneath the key, folded into a tight square, was a photograph. I unfolded it with hands that were not quite steady. The photograph showed a little girl, perhaps 8 years old, blonde braids, a gap-toothed smile that contained absolutely nothing complicated, the pure, uncalculated joy of a child on a good day. She was standing on the porch of this very house, in front of a column I recognized from my arrival, holding hands with a woman beside her. The woman was not Dorothy. I had seen photographs of Dorothy around the house enough to know her face, the specific architecture of it. This was someone else, older, taller, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to look straight through the surface of the photograph, through the decades between its making, and this moment directly into me. I turned it over. On the back in pencil, faded to the color of smoke, Sarah and great-grandmother Vivian, 1990. Sarah, my mother's name. My mother is a little girl standing on this porch holding hands with a woman named Vivian, who was apparently her great-grandmother. A woman I had never heard of. A woman who, according to every piece of family history I had ever been given, should not exist. I was still kneeling on the floor with the photograph in my hands when I smelled it. Smoke. Thin at first, the way it always begins, the way fire always announces itself before it announces itself. I thought for a moment that I was imagining it, that the stress of the day and the figure in the cornfield and the note about the well water and this photograph of my mother holding hands with a ghost had combined to produce a sensation my mind was manufacturing from nothing. Then I heard Garrett shouting from downstairs. I ran to the window on the north side of the house and I saw it. The old barn, a structure of weathered wood and rusted metal that had stood on this property since before the First World War, was burning. Not just burning, engulfed. The fire had moved through it with a speed and completeness that spoke of help, of someone who knew what they were doing. The orange light of it threw wild shadows across the fields and against the farmhouse walls, and sparks were spiraling up into the black sky in columns, each one rising and going dark like something beautiful dying in slow motion. By the time I got outside, the heat was already a wall I could feel from 30 feet away. Garrett was standing at the edge of it, looking stunned, his phone pressed to his ear, calling for help that was going to arrive too late. The volunteer fire department came in 20 minutes. The barn was already a skeleton of blackened beams, by then glowing orange at the joints where the wood had burned through, and was still consuming itself in slow, sustained heat. 100 years. That barn had stood for 100 years, and it took less than an hour to be reduced to this. I stood watching it with the photograph still in my pocket and Dorothy's warning note folded in my other hand, and I saw it. A dark pickup truck, no headlights, moving slowly down the gravel road that ran along the western edge of the property, moving away from the fire it had just walked away from. I watched it until the darkness swallowed it. The fire trucks left around 3 in the morning. Garrett went back inside talking about motels and insurance, and the specific word cursed in a tone that suggested he was already revising his opinion of what this property was worth and whether any amount of money was compensation enough for being here. I stayed on the porch. I sat on the old steps and watched the embers breathe in the dark, that slow orange pulse of something still consuming itself. And I thought about the figure in the cornfield and the note about the well water and the photograph of my mother with a woman who was supposed to be dead. That was when the truck came back up the driveway. It moved slowly without headlights, engine a low murmur in the dark. I was on my feet immediately, and I reached for the shovel that was leaning against the porch railing beside me before I had made any conscious decision to do so. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He was old, 70 perhaps, or close to it. He wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and his hands, visible in the ambient glow of the dying barn, were the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of his adult life. His hair was gray. His face was weathered in the specific way of people who have spent decades outdoors, not as recreation, but as occupation. And his eyes when they found me were the saddest eyes I had seen on any living person since I sat beside my mother's hospital bed. "Put down the shovel," he said. His voice was gravel and old wood and something that had been carrying weight for a very long time. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because someone needs to be and I'm the only one left." I did not put down the shovel immediately, but I held it differently. "Who are you?" "Roland Briggs. People have called me Ro for 40 years. I managed this farm for Dorothy from the time her husband passed until she died. I kept things running. I kept things quiet. I helped her keep certain secrets that were not mine to tell until now." He looked at the ruined barn and something moved across his face that was controlled only by long practice. "Harlow's men did this. Same as they've done before. Same as they'll keep doing until you sign those papers and leave, or until they find another way to make the problem disappear." "What problem?" I asked. "You," he said simply, "and what you might find now that you're here and Dorothy can't protect what she's been protecting." He looked at me steadily across the few feet of dark between us. "Come inside. Sit down. There are things you need to know tonight before daylight gives Harlow's people another opportunity. Things your grandmother wanted you to know, but couldn't find a way to tell you safely, and now the time for finding a better way has passed." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table with the place setting that was still laid out, the half glass of water, the silent testament to a dinner guest who had never arrived. Roland held the photograph I had found under the floorboards, looking at it with the careful attention of someone reuniting with something they have not seen in a long time, but have thought about constantly. "Your great-grandmother," he said, "Vivian Aldridge." "She's supposed to be dead," I said. "She disappeared in 1999. My mother told me." "Your mother told you what Dorothy told her to tell you. What was safe to tell." Roland set the photograph down on the table between us, face up. "Vivian didn't die in 1999, Nora. She didn't disappear. Dorothy helped her fake her own death and has been hiding her ever since. 25 years. The kitchen was very quiet around us. Outside, the embers of the barn were still breathing their slow orange light through the window. "That's not possible," I said. And then, because I was 17, and I had already learned that the world does not adjust itself to accommodate what seems possible, I said, "Why?" Roland's hands folded together on the table. He was a man choosing his words the way a careful person chooses footing on uncertain ground, testing each one before committing his weight to it. "In 1982, he began. Vincent Harlow's father, William Harlow, wanted this land. He wanted all of it. He had plans of resort development, that whole dream. Golf courses, vacation properties, the works. The Aldridge family had owned these 80 acres for 4 generations. Your great-great-grandfather built that farmhouse with his own hands in 1902. They had been offered money before and refused. The land was not for sale. It was never going to be for sale." He paused. A truck passed on the distant highway, its sound reaching us thin and faint. "So William Harlow took it another way. He paid a county clerk to forge transfer documents. He bribed a federal judge to validate them in court. 200 acres gone, taken out from under this family through paper and corruption and the kind of power that had spent years making friends with people who were supposed to prevent exactly that. And when Vivian started to investigate, started gathering evidence of what they'd done, William Harlow sent men to this house in the middle of the night, told her very clearly what would happen to Dorothy if she kept pulling that thread." I thought of the figure in the cornfield, the slow, deliberate point. "But Vivian didn't stop," I said. I knew before he confirmed it. Something in the photograph, in those eyes that looked through the camera and through time, told me. "She didn't stop," Roland said. "She gathered evidence for 17 more years. Photographs of meetings that weren't supposed to happen, recordings of conversations that weren't supposed to be recorded, the original forged documents that proved what the Harlows had done. She built a case that would have brought the entire Harlow empire down. And in August of 1999, she was finally ready. She had enough. She was scheduled to testify before a federal court on the 16th of August. He stopped. The silence stretched between us. "The night before," I said, "she disappeared." The night before, Roland confirmed, the Harlows came to her with a different kind of argument. Not evidence, not lawyers. The kind of argument that has no counter because it doesn't operate by the rules of logic or law. They told her what would happen to Dorothy if she testified. Dorothy was young then, a young woman trying to run a farm and raise a daughter alone. They told Vivian exactly what her daughter's life would look like if she walked into that courtroom. The old man's jaw tightened, the muscles in it working against something. So Vivian made a choice. She chose Dorothy's life over the case, over justice, over 25 years of her own life. His voice dropped lower, and Dorothy, who understood what her mother was sacrificing, did the only thing she could do in return. She helped Vivian disappear, built a shelter deep in the old Blackstone quarry 5 miles from here. Air filtration, water supply, everything necessary to sustain life in an underground space. Visited every 3 days with food and supplies. Kept her mother alive in the dark, while the world went on believing Vivian Aldridge had simply ceased to exist. I sat with this information, feeling the weight of it settle into my body, into my understanding of what the word sacrifice actually means when you remove it from abstraction and put it in a real place, attach it to real people, measure it in days and months and years and decades. Dorothy died 5 days ago, I said. Roland nodded once, slowly. Vivian is 89 years old, he said. She has been alone in that bunker without food or water for nearly a week. The system Dorothy built is sound. It can sustain her for a time, but that time is not unlimited. He looked at me across the table, and his voice was completely level and completely serious in a way that left no room for anything other than the direct meaning of the words. If we don't find her tonight or tomorrow at the latest, Nora, she will die down there. I looked at the photograph on the table, at my mother's 8-year-old face, at Vivian's eyes. I thought of a woman who had chosen to live underground for 25 years so that her daughter could live above it, who had given up sky and seasons and the ordinary, remarkable texture of a life lived in the open world, and had given it up not in some moment of heroic abstraction, but in the specific, calculated daily reality of that bunker day after year, because she loved someone more than she loved her own freedom. The key, I said, the coordinates. Roland nodded. They'll get you close, but not all the way. Dorothy split the information in two for safety. He looked at his hands. She kept one half here, which you found. The other half she gave to the one man she trusted completely with the operational details of how to reach the bunker. A private investigator named Gerald Cross, who spent years working alongside Dorothy to document the Harlow's crimes. Where is he? Gerald died 5 years ago. Roland held my gaze. But his wife Mildred is still alive. She's in a memory care facility in Cedar Falls, about 3 hours from here. If anyone knows where Gerald kept the other half of the information, it's her. He stood up from the table, moved to the kitchen window, and looked out at the cooling ruins of the barn, the embers still breathing in the dark. We leave before Garrett wakes up, he said, before Harlow's people have another opportunity. He turned and looked at me. You found the box under the floor. You have the key. You understand now what it opens. A pause. Dorothy spent 25 years making sure this moment could exist. Someone coming. Someone who would know what to do with what she left. I looked at the photograph one more time. At the little girl with the gap-toothed smile who would grow up to become my mother. At the woman beside her who had made a choice in August of 1999 that had required everything. I put the photograph carefully in my jacket pocket. I picked up the velvet box with the key and the coordinates. I stood up from the kitchen table. Tell me everything you know about the Blackstone quarry, I said. Tell me while we drive. Outside, the last of the embers were going dark. The Montana sky above the ruined barn was beginning to show the very first edge of pre-dawn gray along the eastern mountains, that slow suggestion of morning that arrives hours before the sun. We had very little time, and somewhere in the dark beneath the earth, an 89-year-old woman was still waiting. As she had been waiting with a patience that passed all ordinary understanding for 25 years. I was not going to let her wait any longer. Roland Briggs drove the way men of his generation drove long distances in the dark. Steady and unhurried, with the quiet competence of someone who had covered this particular stretch of Montana highway enough times to have stopped noticing it as a journey and started experiencing it simply as time between one place and another. The heater in his old truck worked imperfectly, putting out warmth in uneven pulses, and I sat with my jacket pulled close and the velvet box in my lap and watched the darkness outside the passenger window give way slowly, grudgingly, to the pale gray suggestion of morning. I had left a note for Garrett on the kitchen table. Gone to handle some estate paperwork. Back later. Vague enough to buy time. Specific enough that he would not immediately panic and start making phone calls to people I was not yet sure I wanted notified of my movements. The decision to leave without telling him where I was actually going had not required much deliberation. Something in the way Garrett had stepped forward when Vincent Harlow made his offer, the particular quality of his eagerness, the way he had said the girl and I as though that he had any authority over what I did or did not do with a property that had been left specifically and exclusively to me, had been sitting in the back of my mind since it happened, accumulating weight. I had not yet put a name to what I suspected, but I had filed it where I filed things that needed more information before I could deal with them honestly. Tell me about the quarry, I said. Roland was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not reluctance, but rather the gathering of something that has not been spoken aloud in a long time. Blackstone Quarry operated from 1921 until 1989, he said. Limestone operation. At its peak, it employed 40 men from Millhaven in the surrounding county. Good work, steady pay, the kind of operation that becomes part of the identity of a place. He paused. In August of 1989, there was a collapse in the lower tunnels. 3 men died. The owner shut everything down within the week, sealed the main entrances, drained what water he could, walked away from the rest. And Dorothy built Vivian's shelter inside it. Dorothy was an engineer before she came back to run this farm after her father died. Structural engineering, 3 years at Montana State before circumstances called her home. She understood load-bearing systems, ventilation, hydraulics. She knew what that quarry was, knew its layout better than anyone alive after the original surveyor died in 1997. She spent the better part of 2 years building what she built in there. Working at night, working alone, moving materials a little at a time, so no pattern would emerge that anyone watching might notice. I thought about that, the scale of it, the patience it required, the specific kind of love that sustains that kind of patience. Harlow Development bought the quarry 2 years ago, I said. I had read it in Dorothy's newspapers, had seen the circled headline with her marginal annotation in red pen. A question mark followed by 2 words underlined 3 times, they, no. Paid almost nothing for it, Roland confirmed. The environmental liability scared off every other buyer. Harlow's lawyers structured the purchase to minimize exposure, and his people put a fence around the perimeter and posted guards and did no actual remediation work whatsoever. Because the purchase wasn't about the land. The purchase was about making sure no one wandered into that quarry and found what was inside it. He glanced at me briefly in the gray half-light of the early morning. Vincent Harlow has always known or strongly suspected that Vivian's disappearance in 1999 was not a voluntary vanishing. He knew his father had threatened her. He knew she had evidence that could destroy everything the Harlow name represented in this county. He needed to control the space. But he didn't know exactly where in the quarry Dorothy had built it. No one did except Dorothy and Gerald Cross and me. And Gerald Cross is gone. And Dorothy is gone. He looked at the road ahead of them, which is why the other half of the information matters. Cedar Falls was a small city, the kind that exists at the intersection of agricultural economy and regional healthcare, with a main street that had seen better decades and a ring of medical facilities on its outskirts that served the surrounding counties. We arrived as the morning was becoming undeniable, the sky having committed fully to daylight by the time Roland turned into the parking lot of Cedar Falls Memory Care. The facility was a low brick building arranged around a central courtyard garden that was this early in the year still mostly bare branches in the memory of flowers. It had the careful cheerfulness of places that work very hard to counteract the essential sadness of what they are, hanging baskets and painted walls and a welcome mat that said something optimistic about good days. I walked in alone as we had agreed in the truck. Roland waited. The woman at the reception desk had the particular wariness of someone whose job involves managing the intersection of fragile elderly residents and strangers who arrive claiming relationships. "I'm here to see Mildred Cross," I said. "I'm her great-niece. I've been traveling. We haven't been in contact for some time, but I wanted to see her while I was in the area." The receptionist looked at me for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. "Mildred is in our memory care unit," she said. "She has good days and difficult days. She may not recognize you. She may not be fully coherent." A pause. "Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," I said. Room 14 was at the end of a corridor painted the pale yellow of institutional optimism. I knocked softly and went in. Mildred Cross was small. That was the first thing. The way smallness is sometimes the first thing with very elderly people, as though the years have been gradually returning them to an earlier, more fundamental scale. She was perhaps 80 years old, lying in a bed that seemed generously sized for her, her white hair spread on the pillow with the particular fine quality of extreme age. Her hands, resting on the blanket over her chest, were translucent in the morning light coming through the window, the veins visible beneath the skin in pale blue lines like a map of something. Her eyes were closed. I sat in the chair beside her and said nothing for a moment. The room smelled of talcum powder and old paper and the faint antiseptic undertone that never quite leaves places like this, no matter how much effort is made to disguise it. On the small bookshelf in the corner, I could see the titles on the spines. Romance novels, their covers worn from reading. A Bible with a broken spine. Crossword puzzle collections. And there on the bottom shelf, sitting slightly apart from the others, with the presence of something that does not quite belong to the same category as the things around it, a large atlas, its leather cover darkened with age, its spine thick and stiff. Atlas of America, 1997 edition. Mildred's eyes opened. They were gray and clouded with cataracts, but something moved in them when they found me that was not confusion. Something older and more careful than confusion. "Gerald," she said softly, "is that you, dear?" Her voice was thin, the voice of someone speaking from a long way away from across some distance that was not entirely physical. "No, ma'am," I said gently. I leaned forward slightly so she could see my face more clearly. "My name is Nora Calloway. I'm Dorothy Aldridge's granddaughter." Something changed in her expression. The cloudiness did not clear exactly, but beneath it, something sharpened. Something that had been sleeping chose to wake up. "Dorothy," she said, her voice changed on the name. Something in it contracted slightly the way a person's voice contracts around a word that carries weight. Dorothy was in trouble. Dorothy needed Gerald to help. "Dorothy passed away last week," I said carefully. "But there's someone else who needs help now, Mildred. Vivian Aldridge. Your husband Gerald spent years helping Dorothy keep her safe. I need to find the information he kept." The second half of the map. Mildred was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes moved away from me to the window, to the pale morning light on the courtyard garden outside, and her lips moved slightly without producing sound, as though she was having a conversation with someone I could not hear. Then she said distinctly, "Gerald kept the world on his spine." I went very still. "The world on his spine," I repeated. "He always said that." A thin smile. "When he was keeping something safe, when something was too important to put anywhere obvious, he kept the world on his spine." Her eyes moved to me, and for a moment they were completely clear, completely present, seeing me exactly as I was, with a precision that had nothing to do with memory failing and everything to do with memory selecting. "Bottom shelf," she said. "Gerald put the world on his spine." I stood up from the chair, crossed to the bookshelf, crouched down in front of the bottom shelf, and pulled the atlas out. It was heavier than it should have been for a book of its size, and when I pressed my hand against the spine, I felt it immediately. A hardness beneath the leather, a thickness that was not the binding. I used the small pocket knife I had taken from Dorothy's kitchen drawer that morning, running the blade carefully along the seam where the leather met the end paper, working slowly with the particular patience of someone who understands that what is inside matters more than speed. The old glue released with a dry sound like something exhaling. A folded piece of paper slid out into my hands. Translucent paper, the kind used for technical drawings. Covered in fine lines, topographical notations, measurements, a legend in the lower left corner. It was half of something, and the right edge was torn jagged, designed to match another piece. I took out my phone and pulled up the photograph I had taken before leaving the farmhouse, the image of the marks on the key's tape alongside the coordinates. The lines I had not understood the night before. Now holding the two pieces of information together in my mind, I could see how they connected. The coordinates were not simply a location. They were one half of a precise directional system, meaningless without the spatial context the map provided. I held the atlas page up and let the morning light come through it. The lines resolved. The torn edge of Mildred's half matched the edges of the information on the tape perfectly, two pieces of the same drawing separated and stored in two different places, each half useless without the other. Together, they showed the Blackstone Quarry in complete detail, the topography of it, the layout of the main tunnel system, and in the deepest section of the old ventilation network marked with a red circle rather than an X of specific location. A room, a space that Dorothy had carved out of the existing infrastructure and made into something that could sustain a human life for years, for decades. Mildred's hand reached out and found my wrist with a grip that surprised me with its strength. "Find her," she said. Her voice had the clarity that sometimes comes in moments like this, cutting through whatever fog had settled over the years. Gerald gave up a great deal to keep that secret safe, spent years of his life and risked more than I ever knew until after. Don't let what he protected disappear with him. I covered her hand with mine. Her skin was cool and papery, and she held on for a moment longer than I expected, as though making sure the contact registered. "I'll find her," I said. "I promise." When I came back out into the morning and crossed the parking lot to where Roland was waiting, he took one look at my face and started the engine. We drove back toward Millhaven. The morning had fully established itself by now, the sky clear and cold and very blue over the mountains ahead of us, the kind of Montana morning that makes the world seem larger than you thought it was. I sat with the two halves of the map and worked through what they told me, memorizing the route, the distances, the specific landmarks that would guide us through the quarry's tunnel system in the dark. Roland drove and let me work. We were an hour out of Millhaven when his phone buzzed on the dashboard. He glanced at it. His expression changed. "Cordelia Webb," he said. "She owns the bakery in town. She and Dorothy grew up together. If she's reaching out, she has something." He pulled off the county road into the gravel lot of a closed feed store and called her back. I heard a woman's voice on the other end, low and urgent, speaking too quietly for me to make out words. Roland listened without speaking for the better part of 2 minutes, then said simply, "We'll come now," and ended the call. "She has something Dorothy left with her," he said. "3 months ago, Dorothy told her to give it to you if anything happened." "She knew," I said. "Dorothy knew something was going to happen to her." "Dorothy has known for 6 months," Roland said. "She knew from the moment she sent that water sample to the lab in Billings." He pulled back onto the road. I looked out the window at the fields going past and thought about a woman who had known she was being slowly killed, who had kept that knowledge to herself, who had spent the time she had left, making sure that every piece of what she had protected would find its way to the right hands after she was gone. The Millhaven Bakery occupied a narrow building on the main street of town, pressed between a hardware store that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration and an empty storefront with sun-faded property listings still taped to the inside of the dusty window. The smell when I pushed open the door was immediate and disarming: warm bread and brown sugar, and something with cinnamon in it that pulled at the stomach with uncomplicated insistence. Cordelia Webb was behind the counter. She was tall, lean, perhaps 75 years old, with white hair pulled back severely and eyes that moved over me with the swift, comprehensive attention of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people quickly and accurately. Her apron was dusty with flour. Her hands, when she turned to the sign on the door to close and pulled the blinds on the front window, moved with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this particular moment. "Sit down," she said, and her voice carried the remnant of an accent that had been smoothed by decades but not entirely erased. She gestured to a small table near the back wall away from the windows. We sat. She did not. "Vincent Harlow has a man watching this building," she said without a preamble. "Has had since Dorothy's funeral. He knows that Dorothy and I were close, and he's watching everyone who was close to her, looking for threads he can pull." She looked at me with those quick, comprehensive eyes. "He knows you went to Cedar Falls this morning. He'll know what you found there." "How do you know what he knows?" I asked. The thin, humorless edge of a smile. "Because I've been watching him for 40 years. That's how long Dorothy and I were friends. Since we were girls running barefoot on the same gravel roads. When the Harlows stole her family's land, I was there. When Vivian disappeared, I helped Dorothy manage what came after. And when Dorothy decided to do what she did, I was one of the 3 people in the world she trusted with any part of the truth." She reached under the counter and produced a tin box. Old, the metal oxidized to a dark gray, dented at one corner from something that had happened to it in its history. She set it on the table between us. "She gave me this 3 months ago. When she understood what was happening to her, she said if anything happened before she could get it to you herself, I was to put it in your hands directly and no one else's. I opened the box. The letters were bundled in groups of perhaps 20, tied with ribbon, that had once been blue and had faded over time to the color of winter sky. There were perhaps a dozen bundles, hundreds of letters in total, all addressed in the same handwriting, a clear, deliberate cursive that showed none of the tremor of Dorothy's final years. All addressed to the same name, Sarah Aldridge, Chicago, Illinois. All marked with the same stamp, a rectangular impression in red ink that said 3 words returned to sender. Some of the envelopes had forwarding addresses that had been crossed out. Some had been returned multiple times, accumulating additional stamps, additional forwarding attempts, each one a record of the particular geography of a person trying to stay hidden while someone else tried to find them. My mother had moved over the years with the practiced deliberateness of someone who was making it difficult to be found, changing addresses, changing her last name when she married Garrett, building a life that left as few traceable threads as possible. Dorothy had sent a letter every month for 20 years. Every single one had come back. I picked up one envelope from the middle of a bundle. The postmark said 2011, which would have made me 7 years old, which would have made my mother 37 the year she got the diagnosis that would eventually, 6 years later, finish what it started. The letter inside was 2 pages written front and back in that careful cursive. I read it. Dorothy wrote about the farm, about the way the light fell across the kitchen in the early morning that summer, the same light that had fallen across that kitchen for 100 years. She wrote about a bird's nest she had found under the eaves of the porch, 4 eggs in it, perfect and small and improbably blue. She wrote about Roland fixing the tractor for the 3rd time that year and complaining about the parts with the specific, eloquent profanity of a man who is comfortable with machinery and deeply uncomfortable with its failures. And then she wrote about my mother. She wrote about the quality of missing someone you love and cannot reach, about the strange mathematics of absence, the way the missing of a person does not diminish with time, but rather accumulates each day, adding its small weight to everything that came before it. She wrote that she understood why Sarah had to go, understood the necessity of the distance Sarah had put between herself and this place and this family. She wrote that understanding did not make it hurt less and that she had stopped expecting it to. She wrote about me. She wrote about a granddaughter she had never met, a child growing up in Chicago, a girl who carried both the Aldridge stubbornness and, she suspected from what Roland had been able to find out over the years, something of her own mother's particular quality of stillness, of being completely present in a room in a way that made the room feel different. She wrote, I want so badly to know her. I want to know what she laughs at and what she reads, and whether she has your habit of going completely quiet when something matters to her most. I want to know if she has your eyes. I want to be able to look at her and see you in her and love you through her the way grandmothers are supposed to be allowed to do. Instead, I write letters that come back to me and I put them in a box, and I tell myself that someday the world will change enough that the distance between us will close. I put the letter down on the table. Something had happened to my throat, some constriction that had arrived without announcement and showed no interest in leaving. Cordelia Webb was watching me with those quick eyes, and in them now was something that had nothing to do with quickness or efficiency, something much older and more patient than either of those things. She wrote every month, I said, the first of every month, without exception, for 20 years. Cordelia sat down across from me, something she had not done until now, and folded her hands on the table in a way that suggested she had something further to say and was choosing how to say it. Your mother never received a single one. You understand that, not one letter. Every time Dorothy found a new address, tried a new approach, the letter came back. Sarah moved, changed her name, stayed below the surface, because that was what she had been told she had to do to keep you safe. My mother knew, I said. She knew Vivian was still alive. Dorothy told her before she left. Dorothy told her the essential facts when Sarah was 18 and old enough to understand them. Told her what had been done with the land, what the Harlows were capable of, what Vivian had sacrificed to give their family whatever safety they still had. Told her that the safest thing she could do for herself, and eventually for any children she had, was to go somewhere the Harlows couldn't find her easily and stay there. And my mother kept that promise for over 20 years, I said. Never came back, never tried to contact them. Built a life that was deliberately difficult to trace. I thought about the particular quality of sadness I had noticed in my mother, sometimes the specific variety of it that arrived without apparent cause, that settled over her in quiet moments when she thought I was not watching. The faraway look that could come over her face during ordinary things dinners, car rides, evenings on the couch as though she was briefly somewhere else entirely, somewhere she could see but could not reach. I understood it now. She had been homesick for 20 years without ever once telling me what home meant or where it was. "There's something else in the box," Cordelia said quietly. I looked down. Beneath the bundles of letters at the very bottom of the tin was an envelope different from the others. It had no address on it, had never been sent. It was sealed, but my name was written on the front in a hand I recognized now as Dorothy's, written at a time when her hands were steadier than they had been in her final years. Nora. I opened it carefully. One page. The handwriting controlled and deliberate, every word chosen with the precision of someone who knows they will not have the opportunity to revise. It said, "By the time you read this, I will not be here to explain myself, so I will try to explain myself now. I did not reach out to you directly, because reaching out to you directly was the one thing that could have put you in danger. Vincent Harlow watches for threads leading back to this family, the way a spider watches its web. If I had written to you, if I had found you, if I had done any of the things I wanted to do from the first day I knew you existed, I would have handed him exactly the thread he needed. You were safe precisely because he could not find you. The moment he could find you, the safety ended. I bought you 17 years of safety by staying silent. I am sorry it cost what it cost. I am sorry for your mother's sake most of all. But Vivian is still alive and she is waiting, and you are the only one who can finish what I could not finish. You are the only one who can bring her home. The evidence she has kept safe for 25 years is in the box beneath her bed. It is everything. It is enough to end this finally and completely if you can get it into the right hands. You will know what to do. You are a Calloway and an Aldridge, and you are your mother's daughter, which means you have already done harder things in this and survived them. Go find her. Bring her home." I folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then I put it carefully in my jacket pocket with the photograph of my mother and Vivian. Cordelia was watching me. "One more thing," I said. "Roland told me Dorothy switched to bottled water after she got the test results back. She knew she was being poisoned, and she did not go to the authorities." "Why?" Cordelia's expression shifted. "Because the authorities in this county have been compromised by Harlow money for 30 years. The county sheriff was elected on Harlow donations. The water board is chaired by a Harlow associate. Going to local authorities with evidence of Harlow wrongdoing in Millhaven is not going to the authorities. It is going directly to Harlow." She looked at me steadily. Dorothy understood that the only way this ends is with evidence so complete and so public that it cannot be buried regardless of who tries. Federal level, not county level. She spent her last months making sure that evidence was still intact and that you would know where to find it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I thought of something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the previous night, accumulating questions the way standing water accumulates over time. "Garrett," I said. "He knew Vincent Harlow. When Harlow showed up yesterday, it was not the introduction of a stranger. There was a recognition between them, something practiced." Cordelia's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. "Tell me," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "I can tell you what Dorothy told me," she said finally. "And I can tell you that Dorothy told me this not in anger but in the particular exhausted grief of someone who had run out of other ways to feel about something." She folded her hands on the table again. "Garrett Calloway was in significant debt when he met your mother. Medical debt, some investment failures, the kind of accumulated financial pressure that makes people receptive to offers they would not otherwise consider. Vincent Harlow found him. Harlow was looking for anyone with a connection to the Aldridge family, any thread that led back to what he knew or suspected Dorothy was protecting. When Garrett married your mother, he became that thread." I felt the cold of it move through my arm. "Harlow offered to clear Garrett's debt," Cordelia continued. "The arrangement was simple. If and when anything happened to Dorothy when the estate became relevant, Garrett would make sure you sold quickly and cleanly. He would manage you toward the outcome Harlow wanted before you had time to understand what you were walking into." "That's why Vincent was there so fast," I said. "The moment Harlan Nash called me, Garrett called Harlow." Before Nash's call had finished, I would imagine. I thought about the morning before we left Chicago, the way Garrett had said straightforward, the way he had been checking his phone before we even got in the car, the way he had stepped forward when Vincent Harlow produced his business card with an eagerness that had felt wrong even in the moment. My mother, I said. Did she know? Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Dorothy believed Sarah suspected something in her final years, that the fear she had carried since leaving Montana, the careful, quiet life she had built, was complicated in ways she had not anticipated by the man she had married. She met my eyes. Dorothy wrote one final letter to your mother when she learned Sarah was ill. An actual letter, not the return kind. She found a way to deliver it through a third party. Whether Sarah received it, whether she read it, whether she understood it fully before she died, that Dorothy never knew. I looked down at the bundled letters in the tin box. 20 years of words that went nowhere, accumulating in a box, waiting for the day someone would finally be able to receive them. Outside the bakery window behind the closed blinds, I could hear the sounds of Millhaven's morning beginning. A truck on the main street, the distant bell of a door opening somewhere down the block. The ordinary sounds of a small town's ordinary day. We need to go tonight, I said. We cannot wait. Cordelia nodded once. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded piece of paper. There is a way in that Vincent's guards do not cover, she said. An air intake shaft on the north perimeter, hidden in the brush. It is how Dorothy accessed the bunker for 25 years. It drops down into the old ventilation system, 50 feet of rusted ladder to a catwalk above the flooded lower level. She slid the paper across the table to me. Directions, a description of the shaft, notes on the ladder's condition, and the passages below. She paused. The rusted sections are on the left side of the ladder. Stay to the right on the way down. I picked up the paper, folded it, put it with the map. Then something occurred to me. Something that had been bothering me since Roland's account of 1999, a detail that sat slightly wrong, a small stone in a shoe. Roland said the tape Vivian recorded captured William Harlow admitting to what he'd done, I said. But you said this has to be federal level. One elderly man's confession recorded covertly in 1999 by a woman who then disappeared and could not authenticate it in court. That should not be enough on its own. Cordelia looked at me with those eyes. Dorothy told you about the tape, she said carefully. She told Roland about the tape, but Dorothy told me something she did not tell the others, about what else is on that tape. She was choosing her words now with a deliberateness that matched the weight she was giving them. William Harlow was not alone in that meeting. His son was with him. Vincent was 35 years old. He had been the operational force behind everything his father did publicly for years by then. The forged documents, the bribes, the intimidation of the Aldrich family. William Harlow was the name in the face. Vincent Harlow was the mechanism. The room felt very still. The tape captures both of them, I said. The tape captures Vincent directing his father, telling him exactly what to say to Vivian about Dorothy's safety, running through the specific threats, establishing what the consequences would be if Vivian appeared in federal court. Cordelia held my gaze. It is not one man's confession. It is the recorded voice of Vincent Harlow, in his own words, coordinating a federal witness intimidation campaign. At 35 years old, against a 74-year-old woman he was trying to silence through fear of what would happen to her daughter. I sat with the full weight of it. Vincent Harlow had not inherited his father's sins. He had built them. He had designed the machinery of them, tested it, refined it, operated it for 40 years with the confidence of a man who believed he had made himself untouchable. And somewhere in a bunker beneath the Blackstone quarry, an 89-year-old woman was lying on a narrow bed with that tape in a box beneath her, having protected it through 25 years of underground darkness, waiting for someone to come and do something with it that its existence had been demanding for a quarter of a century. I closed the tin box, picked it up. Take the letters, Cordelia said. All of them. They belong to you now. I picked up the tin. We'll come to the quarry tonight, after dark. Cordelia stood. Something in her posture changed slightly, the way the posture of someone changes when they have carried something heavy for a long time and are finally able to set it down. I was 9 years old when Dorothy Aldrich and I became friends, she said. 66 years. I have kept parts of her secrets, Oh, for all of that time. I have kept them when it was frightening and when it was lonely and when I was not entirely certain that keeping them was the right thing. She looked at me with those eyes that missed nothing. I want you to know that I never stopped believing it was. Roland was in the truck in the parking lot. When I got in and shut the door, he read something in my face and let the silence be what it needed to be for a moment before he started the engine. I set the tin box on the seat between us. The velvet box with Vivian's key rested on top of it. The folded map from Gerald Cross's atlas was in my jacket pocket, alongside Cordelia's directions to the shaft. Dorothy's last letter was in my chest pocket against my sternum, where I could feel it with every breath. All of it, Roland said. He was asking about what Cordelia had told me. All of it, I confirmed. We drove back toward the farmhouse through the Montana afternoon, the mountains ahead of us catching the declining light in colors that had no adequate names. I thought about what we were going to do in a few hours after dark when the temperature dropped and Vincent Harlow's guards settled into the routine of their watch. I thought about the map and the shaft and the 50 feet of rusted ladder. I thought about a woman who had been waiting with a patience that passed all human accounting in the dark beneath that ridge of stone. I thought about what Garrett was going to do when I walked back into that farmhouse. And I thought about my mother. About those faraway looks that had come over her in quiet moments for as long as I could remember, that specific variety of sadness that arrived without explanation and left the same way. I understood now that what I had been seeing on her face in those moments was not simply grief or tiredness or the particular weight of adulthood. It was the weight of what she knew and could not say. It was the weight of a home she loved that she had been told she could never go back to. It was the weight of a mother who wrote her letters every month and never knew that not one of them arrived. She had died carrying all of that, without telling me. Because telling me would have required telling me things that might have endangered me. She had protected me with her silence the same way Dorothy had protected her. The same way Vivian had protected Dorothy. 3 generations of women protecting the ones that came after them by carrying the full weight of what they knew without sharing it alone quietly for as long as it took. The farmhouse appeared ahead of us at the end of the Mayan Oak Line Drive. The late afternoon light was amber, now warm against the peeling white paint of the old Victorian, making it look for a moment like something out of a memory rather than something standing in the actual present. Garrett's car was in the driveway. He was sitting on the porch steps when we pulled up, waiting. He had been sitting there for a while, I could tell. He was not checking his phone. He was just sitting in the way of someone who has been somewhere long enough to stop performing activity and settle into something more honest. He looked at me when I got out of Roland's truck. Then he looked at the tin box in my hands. Then he looked back at my face. I did not say anything to him. I carried the tin box up the porch steps and past him and set it on the kitchen table where the place setting was still laid out, where the half glass of water still stood catching the light. I opened the box and took out the bundles of letters and set them on the table one by one. Each ribbon-tied bundle, a specific period of years, 2 decades of words that had gone nowhere, all of it laid out in front of him. Then I went upstairs without a word. Let him sit with that. Let the letters speak for themselves as they had been waiting to do for 20 years. Roland knocked on my bedroom door an hour before midnight. "It's time," he said. I was already dressed. The map was in my jacket. The key was in my pocket. Cordelia's directions were memorized every turn, every landmark, every warning about the left side of the rusted ladder. I came out of the room and found Garrett at the top of the stairs. His eyes were red. His face had the look of a man who has read something that has rearranged him fundamentally and is not yet sure what the new arrangement is going to feel like to live in. In his hands, open to a random page somewhere in the middle, was one of Dorothy's letters. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Nora," he said. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, something that had been stripped of all its usual protective layers. "I need to tell you something." "Tomorrow," I said. "Tell me tomorrow." Because tonight there was only one thing. Tonight there was a woman waiting in the dark with the evidence that could end 40 years of stolen land and buried truth, waiting for someone to come and tell her that the waiting was finally over. I walked past Garrett down the stairs and out into the Montana night. The sky above the mountains was enormous and full of stars. More stars than the city had ever let me see, so many that the sky seemed to press downward with the accumulated weight of all that ancient light. The cold was clean and sharp against my face. Roland was already in the truck, the engine running, the headlights off. I got in, and he pulled down the driveway without a word. We drove toward Blackstone Quarry, through the dark Montana night, through the tall grass moving in the wind, in the pine forest, in the road that wound through the foothills, toward the ridge where the quarry sat, a century of extracted limestone, a sealed and guarded and deliberately forgotten wound in the earth. 5 miles. Somewhere beneath that ridge, past the fence and the guards and the flooded lower tunnels, and the 50 feet of rusted ladder, and the catwalk and the sealed steel door that had not been opened since Dorothy's last visit, a woman was waiting. She had been waiting for 25 years. She had one more night to wait. The Blackstone Quarry announced itself before we could see it. There was a smell first, something mineral and cold and deeply old, the particular exhalation of stone that has not seen sunlight in decades rising from the earth the way cold rises from deep water. Then the fence appeared in Roland's headlights, chain-link topped with rusted barbed wire, a perimeter that circled the ridge in a wide, irregular loop. Beyond it, what remained of the quarry's infrastructure stood against the night sky in dark silhouette. The skeletal frame of the old conveyor system, the collapsed roof of the equipment barn, and the quarry itself, the massive pit carved from the limestone ridge over 7 decades of extraction, now filled to an unknown depth with black water that reflected no light at all. Roland cut the headlights 200 yards from the fence and coasted to a stop behind a stand of pines. We sat for a moment in the complete dark. "Main gate is on the south side," he said quietly. 2 guards, minimum. They rotate every 4 hours. Last rotation was at 10, so we have until 2 before they're fully alert again. He looked at me. "The north perimeter is a quarter-mile through the brush. The shaft is where Cordelia said it would be. I have been there twice years ago when Dorothy needed an extra pair of hands she trusted. The ladder holds if you stay to the right and do not rush." "And inside," I said. "Inside you follow the map. Section 4 is the deepest part of the old ventilation network. The crusher unit is a landmark you cannot miss. It is the largest piece of remaining machinery in the tunnel system. The door is behind it." He paused. "Once you are inside the bunker, you will have perhaps 20 minutes before the guard's next sweep brings them through the inner tunnels. Dorothy built the escape system for exactly this situation. Vivian knows how to activate it. She has been briefed on the protocol for 25 years. And if Vivian is not able to activate it herself, then you activate it for her. Red panel on the north wall, protected cover, single button, marked purge." His voice was steady, but I heard something beneath it. "The hydraulic elevator is in the southeast corner of the bunker. It seats 3 people comfortably. Once you flood the outer chamber, you have 90 seconds before the water reaches the elevator threshold. The pressure differential drives the car up automatically, no power required." I nodded once. We moved through the pines and into the brush, staying low, staying quiet. The cold was significant now, the kind that reaches through clothing and settles against the skin with a patient persistence that reminds you it has been here much longer than you have. Dry grass crackled faintly under our feet despite our care. The stars above the ridge were extraordinary. The full weight of the Montana sky, unobstructed by anything built by human hands, and I would have found them beautiful under different circumstances. The fence had a section on the north perimeter where the chain link had been cut and reattached with wire, a repair that had been made to look like part of the original fencing, but was not. Roland found it without searching his hands, going directly to the specific post where the cut began, the knowledge of it stored in his body rather than his mind. We pulled the section back, went through. The air intake shaft was exactly where Cordelia had described it. A concrete cylinder jutting 18 inches above the rocky ground, surrounded by brush that had grown up around it over the years, with the thoroughness of something left entirely to its own devices. The iron grate over the top had rusted to the color of old blood, the bolts that held it corroded past their original function. Roland and I worked at opposite edges of it, working our fingers under the lip, and after a sustained effort that made no sound worth worrying about, the grate came free. The smell that rose from below was the smell of the quarry magnified, stone and standing water and stale air and something else. something that reminded me unexpectedly of old libraries and closed rooms where time had slowed down and paper had been absorbing silence for years. I looked down into the shaft. The ladder was visible for perhaps 8 feet in the beam of my small flashlight before the darkness swallowed it. The rungs were iron, the same color as the grate, narrower than I expected. The shaft walls were slick with condensation. "Right side," Roland said. I went first. The descent was the longest 50 feet I have ever traveled. Each rung required a decision, a deliberate placement of hands and feet, a commitment of weight with the particular caution of someone who has been told that the thing they are trusting has limits and does not know precisely where those limits are. The right side held. The left side had two rungs that shifted when I touched them and would not have held my weight, and I moved past them the way you move past things that could have been catastrophic without allowing yourself to fully register what almost happened. Roland came down behind me. At the bottom, the shaft opened onto a catwalk. Metal suspended perhaps 15 feet above the flooded quarry floor, running in both directions through a cavern that the flashlight beam could not fully illuminate. The scale of the space was difficult to absorb, the ceiling disappearing into darkness above the water below, perfectly still and perfectly black, reflecting our small lights back at us from its surface with the indifference of something very deep. The silence was absolute in a way that silence at the surface never is. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic or machinery. Just the drip of water from somewhere in the darkness above and the sound of our own breathing and the soft metallic resonance of the catwalk shifting fractionally under our weight. I checked the map. Section 4 was east-northeast, following the catwalk to the junction, then through what the map indicated was a connecting passage between the original extraction tunnels and the ventilation network. The crusher unit sat at the junction of the two systems, unmissable, the largest piece of machinery in the entire underground complex. We moved. The beam of my flashlight swept the darkness ahead in arcs, catching the geometry of the tunnel walls, the support columns rising from the flooded floor to the catwalk level, the skeletal remains of equipment left in place when the quarry closed and never retrieved. Everything was the same color down here, the deep gray-brown of stone and oxidized metal, and decades of accumulated moisture, as though the underground had decided over time that distinction between materials was unnecessary and had unified everything into its own palette. I heard them before I saw them. Voices, ahead and below, moving along a passage that ran parallel to our catwalk at the lower level. Two voices speaking in the flat, casual shorthand of men performing a security function they did not consider particularly serious. Flashlight beams moved in the darkness ahead, casting long, swinging shadows across the tunnel walls. Roland's hand found my arm in the dark. We stopped, pressed against the nearest support column, killing our lights. The darkness became total and immediate, pressing against the eyes with a physical quality, and I stood with my back against cold metal and listened to the voices pass below us and recede into the deeper tunnels, the light moving with them, growing smaller. The crusher unit was unmistakable. It occupied the junction of the tunnels like a monument to a particular era of industrial ambition, a machine that had processed thousands of tons of limestone during the quarry's working life and now sat in permanent retirement. Its massive steel housing, rusted solid cobwebs stretching between its components, with the architectural ambition of something that had found a vacancy and decided to make something permanent of it. It was the size of a small house. Its presence in the tunnel redefined the space around it, made everything else a satellite to its mass. Behind it, set directly into the stone wall of the tunnel, was the door. It was steel circular with a wheel mechanism at its center, in the specific design language of something built to withstand pressure rather than simply to provide privacy. The kind of door you find on pressure vessels and submarines, in the underground shelters of people who understood that there might come a time when the world outside needed to be kept out completely. Below the wheel, a keyhole. The old iron key was in my pocket. I had been feeling its weight against my thigh for hours, that cold, specific gravity of something that has been waiting a long time to do the thing it was made to do. My hands were not entirely steady when I inserted it. The lock was old. The mechanism inside it had been sitting in the damp, dark air of this tunnel for years. The tumblers accumulating the slight corrosion of disuse, the tolerances tightening in ways that made the key's movement rough and uncertain. I felt resistance. Heard something that was almost but not quite the sound of engagement. I stopped, closed my eyes for a moment, felt the mechanism rather than forcing it. There was a give somewhere in the resistance, a path through it that existed if I stopped trying to push through and started listening instead. I adjusted the pressure, changed the angle fractionally. The key moved in a way it had not moved before engaging something deeper in the lock. And then there was a sound, a single clean sound, the tumbler releasing, and the wheel turned smoothly, and the door swung open on hinges that had been maintained more recently than anything else about this tunnel. Dorothy had kept the hinges maintained, even that. Even in the last months when she was weakening from what was being done to her water supply, she had kept the hinges oiled so that when the day came, the door would open the way it was supposed to. The air that came through the opening was different from the tunnel air, warmer. Carrying something that was not the cold mineral blankness of the quarry, but was instead the accumulated warmth of habitation, the complex specific atmosphere of a space where someone had been living and breathing and existing for a very long time. I stepped through. The room was small, not cramped, but deliberately proportioned, everything within reach of a person who did not move through it quickly. A narrow bed against the left wall, iron-framed, covered with blankets that had been washed many times until they had achieved a softness that had nothing to do with thread count. A small camp stove on a shelf above a row of empty food canisters. A table the size of a card table with a lantern on it that was dark. A bookshelf covering most of the right wall. The spines of the books turned toward the room in every state of wear, from nearly new to barely holding together, some of them read so many times that the spines had split and been repaired with tape that had itself yellowed and begun to fail. And the walls. I stood in the doorway and looked at the walls, and I stopped breathing for a moment. They were covered from floor to ceiling in drawings. Not randomly, not in overlapping layers the way desperate people cover surfaces, but in a careful, sustained arrangement, each drawing given its own space, each one protected from its neighbors by the deliberate intent of the hand that placed it. Pencil mostly, though, some were done in ink and a few in what appeared to be charcoal, the medium changing over the years as supplies permitted and as the hand that made them aged. They were all the same subject, a girl growing up. A baby in a hospital blanket, the face rendered with the imprecise tenderness of someone working from a description rather than a reference image, every detail an act of imagination constrained by love. A toddler on grass arms reaching upward towards something beyond the frame. A child on a bicycle, the motion of it captured in the suggestion of blurred wheels. A girl at a school desk, one hand raised, the specific posture of someone who knows the answer and cannot quite contain the knowing. A girl at 12 reading in a chair with the unself-conscious absorption of someone completely alone in a book. At 14, laughing at something that happened just outside the frame. At 16, looking at something in the distance with an expression that was beginning to have the complexity of an adult face without having lost the essential quality of a younger one. Every year, every stage. Drawn from the descriptions Dorothy had carried down through the air shaft on her 3-day visits for 17 years, translated by an old woman in an underground room into images on a wall, the act of drawing them a form of presence that was the only form available to her. She had made me out of words. She had watched me grow up through someone else's stories, and she had put me on these walls, and she had lived with these drawings the way other grandmothers live with photographs, which is to say, the way you live with the most important evidence of your life's meaning. Roland had come in behind me, and he was looking at the drawings, and he was not speaking, and the quality of his silence told me that this was not the first time he had seen them, and that they had not diminished in their effect through familiarity. The figure on the bed had not moved. She was small, lying still beneath the blankets, her white hair spread across the pillow. Her face was turned slightly toward the door, toward the source of the sounds we had made entering, and even in the dim wash of our flashlight beams, I could see the translucence of her skin, the fineness of it, the way extreme age makes the body's surface into something that suggests the fragility of everything that sustains us. For one terrible suspended moment, I could not tell if she was breathing. Then her eyes opened. They were blue. The specific blue of a clear sky in late October, deep and without ambiguity, the blue that does not negotiate with other colors. And despite everything, despite the 25 years in the underground darkness, in the 6 days without food or water, and the weakness that was visible in every other part of her, those eyes were completely present, completely awake, looking at me with a recognition that should have been impossible and was entirely real. "You came," Vivian Aldridge said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. It was the voice of someone who had decided at some point far back in the long years that whatever happened, she would not let her voice lose its steadiness. Dorothy always said a Callaway girl would find her way home. I crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt beside her triance, and I took her hand in both of mine. She was cold, the cold of someone whose body has been spending its reserves very carefully for days, rationing itself toward the possibility of rescue with the same deliberate patience that had sustained everything else about her survival here. Her bones beneath my hands felt fine and light, like the bones of a bird engineered for a completely different relationship with gravity than the rest of us. But her grip when her fingers closed around my hands was something else entirely. "I'm Nora," I said. "Nora Calloway, Sarah's daughter." Something moved across her face, a shift beneath the skin that was not quite an expression, but was rather the precursor to all expressions, the moment before a face decides what it is going to do with what it has just received. "I know who you are," she said. "I have known who you are for 17 years. Dorothy described you so well that I felt I knew you before you were old enough to know yourself." A pause, and in the pause, she was gathering breath, managing what she had. "Your favorite color changed from yellow to green when you were 9. You broke your wrist, not your arm, falling from a bicycle when you were 8, and you insisted on going back to school the next day with the cast still wet. Your mother sang to you at bedtime until you told her you were too old for it, and then she quietly kept singing outside your door where she thought you couldn't hear." I pressed my lips together, felt the back of my eyes burn. "She knew," I said. "Didn't she, at the end? She knew you were still here." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy found a way to tell her. When Sarah became very ill, she sent word through a channel that could not be traced back. Whether it helped or hurt to know, I have asked myself that question many times." She looked at me steadily. "I like to believe it helped. I like to believe that knowing her grandmother was still fighting, still alive, still here was a comfort to her at the end, rather than another source of grief. I think it would have helped," I said, "because I meant it, and because she needed to hear it, and because, whatever else was true, this was true." She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she said with a shift to something more urgent, "There is not much time. They come through this section on a schedule. Under the bed, the box." Roland was already moving. He knelt at the edge of the bed and reached beneath it and pulled out the metal box. It was old, the surface of it mottled with the oxidization of years. In underground air, the latch mechanism stiff. He set it on the bed beside Vivian and worked the latch open. Inside, in plastic sleeves that had been the right choice for preservation in this environment, the documents were intact. The original forged transfer documents from 1982, the signatures on them bearing the microscopic inconsistencies that a forensic examiner would recognize immediately as fabrication. Photographs, dozens of them, taken covertly over 17 years, showing meetings between William Harlow and county officials whose names I could read in the marginal notations in Vivian's careful hand. Bank transfer records printed on paper that had aged to the color of old cream. A series of ledger pages showing payments made and received between dates and parties that, when cross-referenced against the photographs and the forged documents, told a complete story of systematic corruption spanning 4 decades. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in a separate sleeve, the cassette tape. It was a standard audio cassette of a type that had been common in 1999 and now existed primarily in the collections of people who understood that some things should not be thrown away until the moment arrives when you know exactly what to do with them. The label on side A said in Vivian's handwriting, "WH, August 14th, 1999. The label on side B said simply VH same. I held it up, looked at it. This small rectangle of magnetic tape that had been sitting in an underground box for 25 years, holding inside it the recorded voices of men who had believed they were untouchable, who had spent all the years since believing that the only person who could use it against them had been effectively neutralized by the very threats captured on it. William admitted everything on side A, Vivian said. She was watching me hold the tape with the expression of someone watching something they have protected for a very long time finally reach the hands it was meant for. The land theft, the forged documents, the bribed officials, a complete confession. But it was Vincent who arranged the meeting. Vincent who decided it needed to happen. He sat beside his father and he ran it. He told William what to say to me. He named Dorothy. He described specifically what they would do to her if I appeared in court. She paused, gathered breath. He was 35 years old and he was utterly certain I would never be in a position to use what he was saying. He was not careful. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who were afraid of him, and it had made him careless in ways he could not see. His own voice, I said, coordinating federal witness intimidation in full detail against a woman in her 70s because she had the evidence to send his father to prison. Her blue eyes held mine. He destroyed my life because he thought he could, because he had always been able to, because no one had ever stopped him and he had stopped believing anyone ever would. She looked at me. I have been waiting 25 years for someone to stop him. From somewhere in the tunnels outside the sound of footsteps, not the casual randomness of a patrol moving through familiar territory. These were moving with purpose, converging, following either a sound or a heat signature, or some instinct that told them something in Section 4 had changed. Vivian's eyes moved to the door, then to me. The panel, she said. I was already moving. The red panel was on the north wall, exactly where Dorothy's letter had described it, a recessed housing behind a protective cover that required a deliberate action to open a design that ensured the system could not be activated accidentally. I pulled the cover open. The button behind it was large and red and very simple, the kind of design that means what it looks like it means without any possibility of misinterpretation. Below it, a single word: purge. Roland was at the bed helping Vivian to a sitting position. She was light, I could see that in the way he moved her, the ease of it, but she was also stronger than she appeared, pushing herself upright with a stubborn competence that was entirely consistent with everything I had been told about her. I looked at the elevator in the southeast corner, a cage roughly 4 feet by 4 feet suspended in an open shaft that ran upward through the rock. The mechanism that connected it to the hydraulic system was visible beneath the cage floor, a series of sealed chambers and pressure valves that Dorothy had designed to convert the weight of incoming water into the upward force that would drive the car to the surface. The footsteps outside were closer. A voice sharp from somewhere beyond the crusher unit. I pressed the button. The sound that followed was the sound of a system waking up that has been asleep for years. First a deep mechanical groan, something shifting in the walls, something turning that had been still for a long time. Then from the passage beyond the bunker door that Roland had not fully closed behind us, the sound of water. Not gradually, immediately, with the full force of pressure that had been building behind sealed valves for years, released all at once into the passage. I heard voices outside rise sharply. Roland had Vivian upright and moving one arm around her waist, her feet finding the ground with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the relationship between intention and motion. I crossed to them and took her other side, and we moved toward the elevator cage, together the three of us, in the ungainly, urgent choreography of people who do not have time to be graceful. The water came under the bunker door. It came in fast, spreading across the floor with a cold that I felt through my shoes, immediately reaching my ankles within seconds of entry. Vivian made no sound as it reached her feet. She kept moving her jaw, set her eyes on the elevator cage. We got her inside. I pulled the cage door shut. Roland wedged himself in behind me, and the three of us stood pressed together in a space designed for exactly 3 people, which is one of the things Dorothy got right, which is to say everything. The water rose, knee-deep, then higher, moving with a speed that compressed the available time into a series of very clear priorities, each one replacing the last with the efficiency of a system doing exactly what it was built to do. I held Vivian against the side of the cage, keeping her above the surface, and I felt the cage begin to shift beneath us, the hydraulic system engaging as the water pressure in the sealed chambers below us reached the threshold Dorothy had calculated. Then the mechanism caught fully. The elevator car moved upward with a lurch that threw us against the walls and then stabilized into a sustained descent, rising through the shaft, cut into the limestone, at a speed that increased as the pressure differential below us grew. The water in the bunker was rising, and we were rising ahead of it, the darkness of the shaft giving way as we ascended to a different quality of darkness, the darkness of night air rather than underground stone. We burst through the surface. The cold night air hit me like something I had forgotten was possible. Clean and sharp and full of the smell of pine and dry grass and the particular freshness of Montana at midnight, and I pulled it into my lungs with a gratitude that was entirely physical, the gratitude of a body reminding itself what it requires. The elevator platform skidded to a stop on a concrete pad that had been poured at the surface decades ago to serve the quarry's original ventilation system. The cage door swung open and I stepped out and helped Vivian onto solid ground under an open sky, and she stood holding my arm and she looked up. She looked up at the stars. She stood very still looking up at the Montana sky with an expression that I did not have a word for and do not have a word for now. Something that contained within it 25 years of underground ceilings, 25 years of artificial light, 25 years of a sky that existed only in memory and imagination, and in the descriptions of a daughter who visited every 3 days and tried to bring the world down with her in words. She did not say anything. She just looked up. And then a voice cut through the night. That was quite a performance. Vincent Harlow stood 15 yards from the elevator platform. He had not bothered with pretense about how he came to be here. He was dressed practically not in his usual suit, and the two men standing several yards behind him were dressed even more practically. His silver hair was disheveled, and his expression was the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life ensuring that certain things never happened, and is now watching them happen anyway, and is cycling through his available responses with the speed of someone who is running out of options, but has not yet accepted that. "You've flooded my quarry," he said, "destroyed equipment worth considerably more than the offer I made you. All for what, an old woman and some papers that have been underground so long they won't survive legal scrutiny." I was already recording. I had my phone out before he said the second sentence. The live function engaged the signal from the surface, connecting immediately to every platform I had loaded before we descended. The view counter in the corner of my screen is climbing with a speed that told me the stream was being found and shared in real time. "The papers survived very well," I said. "Dorothy built that box specifically to protect them from the environment. And the tape has been stored in better conditions underground than most archivists would manage above it." I held my phone steady. "The tape with your voice on it, Vincent. The one you recorded in August of 1999, when you sat next to your father and told him exactly how to threaten a 74-year-old woman into abandoning her federal testimony." The expression on his face changed, not dramatically. Vincent Harlow was a man who had trained himself out of dramatic expressions over decades of operating in situations where showing your hand was a form of weakness. But something happened behind his eyes. Something cold and quick and deeply calculating, moving through its assessments at a speed that was almost visible. "You're live," he said, looking at my phone. 60,000 people, I said, "and climbing." He looked at the phone, at the screen facing him that showed the view counter, the comments filling the feed with the velocity of people reacting in real time to something they are watching and cannot quite believe is actually happening. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his cheek. "I have lawyers who have been managing this family's legal exposure for 40 years, he said, and his voice had found its way back to a smoothness that was impressive in its resilience. "Whatever you think you have, whatever that tape actually contains, I have resources to contest, delay, and bury anything you put in front of a court for longer than you have been alive." "Federal court," I said, "not county." Something shifted. "Federal evidence," Roland said from where he stood beside Vivian. "From a federal witness whose disappearance in 1999 has been an open federal case for 25 years. Your father's confession, your voice directing the witness intimidation. The original forged documents from 1982, with the forensic history of every official whose signature appears on them." Vivian had not said anything since we reached the surface. She was standing with her hand on Roland's arm, and she was looking at Vincent Harlow with an expression that was entirely without heat. It was something colder and more final than heat. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for 25 years and has arrived at last at the moment when they can set it down. Vincent Harlow took a step forward, and then the lights came. Not from one direction, from three. Vehicles coming up the quarry road with the kind of systematic convergence that speaks of coordination of an approach planned in advance of something that has been in motion for longer than anyone on this platform could have arranged tonight. The lights were followed by the specific sound profile of federal vehicles, the particular timbre of engines and doors that have nothing to do with local law enforcement. The lead vehicle stopped 20 yards from the platform. A door opened. Garrett got out. He looked the way a man looks who has been awake for the full depth of a night doing something that terrified him and doing it anyway. His eyes found mine immediately and held them, and in them I saw something I had not seen in his face through all the months I had lived with him in that Chicago apartment, something I had not believed was there to see. Not the performance of concern, actual, specific, costly remorse. "I called them," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual careful management. He was speaking to me, but also in the way of people making public confessions to everyone present. "I called the FBI last night after I read Dorothy's letters. I read them for 3 hours at that kitchen table." He stopped, steadied himself. "I told them everything. The money Harlow paid me, when he paid me, what I agreed to do in exchange. What I did years ago that I've been telling myself wasn't my fault, that it wasn't really causing harm." His jaw worked. "I told them about Sarah, about what my giving her address away meant for the last years of her life." His voice broke on the last sentence. He put it back together. "I know that doesn't fix it. I know there is no way to fix it. But I couldn't let them hurt you. Not when I finally understood what your mother had sacrificed to keep you safe." The FBI agents had moved around Vincent Harlow's position with the quiet efficiency of people doing a job they have done many times. Vincent watched them approach with the particular stillness of a man performing the internal calculation of someone who has spent decades believing in the absolute reliability of his resources and is discovering in real time that the ground was not as solid as it appeared. He said something about lawyers, and then a third vehicle stopped behind the others, a car rather than an official vehicle, and the door opened and a young man got out. He was perhaps 28 years old with the silver-touched brown hair of a man who had started graying early, and in his face I could see the specific genetic echo of Vincent Harlow's bone structure, without any of the decades of cultivated cruelty that had reshaped the original into what it had become. He moved through the space between the vehicles with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made a decision that he knows is irreversible and is walking toward its consequences with open eyes. He was carrying a book, a leather-bound journal, dark brown, the cover worn at the corners with the particular softening of an object that has been handled frequently over many years. Vincent Harlow saw his son, and something happened in his face that was the first thing I had seen in it all night that was not performed. Something involuntary and unguarded and raw. "Owen," he said, just the name. Owen Harlow stopped in front of his father. He held the journal between them. "Grandfather's journal," he said. His voice was quiet and steady, the steadiness of something that has been decided rather than the steadiness of something that has never been shaken. "The one he kept in the safe at the house. I found it 3 weeks ago when I was going through his papers after the estate settlement." He opened it to the last pages to entries in a hand that had grown progressively less controlled over years, the writing of a man aging toward the end of his ability to hold a pen steady. He documented everything, every transaction, every official who took money, every threat made against the Aldridge family, every decision he made and why he made it. He turned to the final entry, read it aloud. "Vivian Aldridge was right about everything we did to her family. I have known this since 1995, and I have done nothing about it because my son would not allow it, because Vincent built this on my cowardice and told me that cowardice was wisdom, and I believed him because I needed to." A pause. Owen's voice did not waver. "God forgive what my son made me do. God forgive what I permitted in order to keep peace with a man who should have been afraid of me and was not." The silence after he finished reading was the complete silence of the quarry at 2 in the morning, the wind and the stars and the cold and nothing else. "I'm prepared to testify to the authenticity of the journal," Owen said to the FBI agents now, rather than to his father. "I'm prepared to provide everything I know about my father's business practices, the specific instances I was aware of, the conversations I witnessed over the years that I told myself I didn't understand the full implications of." He glanced at his father once briefly with an expression that contained grief and resolution in proportions that only he could fully account for. I understand what this means for the family name. I decided that the family name doesn't deserve protecting. They took Vincent away. He did not speak again. He walked to the federal vehicle with the two agents beside him and got in, and the door closed and he was gone. The quiet that replaced the sound of that engine was the quiet of something that has been building pressure for 40 years, finally completely releasing. Owen Harlow stood apart from the activity, watching the vehicles move, and then he turned and found me across the space between us. He looked at me for a moment with those eyes that carried their own specific weight. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for everything the Harlow name has done to your family. I know that doesn't begin to cover it." I looked at him for a moment, thought about the letters in the tin box, about my mother's face in the quiet moments when she thought I wasn't watching, about the specific cost of 40 years of stolen land and buried truth measured in the currency of actual human lives. "No," I said, "it doesn't, but it's a place to start." He nodded once, accepted that. Vivian was sitting on the edge of the concrete pad with Roland beside her, and she was still looking at the sky. I went and sat beside her on her other side, and for a long time none of us said anything. The three of us together in the Montana night with the stars above us, and the warmth of what had just happened still moving through the air around us like a temperature change. "It's over," Vivian said finally. She said it softly, not to me or to Roland specifically, but to the sky, to the night, to whatever it is that receives these words when we finally say them after the long time it takes to get there. After all of this, it's finally over. I put my arm around her shoulders, felt the fragility and the surprising solidity of her, at the same time the paradox of someone who had survived things that should have broken her through the simple, sustained application of refusing to be broken. "It's not over," I said. "It's just beginning." She looked at me. "Dorothy said you would say something like that," she said, and she smiled. 6 months. The leaves on the oak trees that lined the driveway turned from green to gold and then let go, and the branches reached bare into a November sky, the color of old iron. And then December came with its early dark and its cold that had real weight to it, the serious cold of a Montana winter, settling in for its long occupation of the landscape. The farmhouse was painted a warm yellow, now the color Vivian said it had been in 1958 when she and her husband brought their daughter home for the first time. The color that the house had worn for 30 years before the money ran out and the painting stopped and the white of it began its slow retreat. The porch had been rebuilt, new wood replacing the rotted sections, the left side leveled and braced. The windows were clear and whole. The old hand pump by the well had been removed and the well itself tested and recertified, and the note on the kitchen table, Dorothy's last careful warning, had been kept. I had placed it in a frame. It hung on the wall above the kitchen table where she had left it, where I could see it every morning. "Don't drink the well water. The 200 acres were ours again." The federal ruling had come in October, the result of a case built on the evidence in Vivian's box, and Gerald Cross's preserved documentation, in William Harlow's own journal entries, in the taped voice of his son, directing crimes that had never once been investigated because the county had been too thoroughly purchased to investigate them. The Harlow name, which had been synonymous with power in this part of Montana for 40 years, was now synonymous with something else, the specific kind of infamy that attaches to people who believe their money made them permanent. Vincent Harlow was facing 14 federal counts. Garrett had cooperated fully with the federal investigation. He had received a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony. He was not free of what he had done, and I had not told him he was. But he had done what he could with what remained to him after understanding what he had been part of, and I had watched him do it, and I was still watching to see what he was going to do next. He came to the farm on weekends. He had started helping with the things that needed doing, not asking for credit, not performing redemption, just showing up and working. He had planted bulbs along the south fence in October, daffodils and tulips, Sarah's favorites, pressing them into the cold earth with the particular care of someone planting something for a spring they are not certain they deserve to see. Vivian recovered. The doctors had used the word remarkable several times in the early weeks, by which they meant that the body of a woman who had spent 25 years underground should not have responded the way her body responded to sunlight and proper nutrition and fresh air, and the specific medicine of having nothing left to hide from. She was thinner than she should have been, and she tired easily, and the cane she used was not for show. But she was present in the world in a way that filled rooms that made the farmhouse feel like a place where life was happening rather than simply being maintained. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs on the morning I found the box. I had been clearing the root structure of the old willow stump, working at the edges of it with a mattock in the cold, clear air of an early December morning, loosening the ancient roots from the soil that had held them for a century before the tree died. The plan was to plant something new in the spring, something that would grow for another 100 years, and to do that, the old root system had to come up. The mattock hit something that was not root and was not rock. I went down on my knees in the cold dirt. The box was small, perhaps the size of a large hardback book made of tin that had oxidized deeply over the decades to a dark mottled surface. It had been buried perhaps 18 inches below the surface, deep enough that frost heaves had not disturbed it, deep enough that no ordinary disturbance of the soil would find it. Someone had chosen the depth carefully. The lid was fastened with a small clasp that had rusted solid. I worked it free with the flat edge of the mattock blade gently, and the lid opened with a resistance that felt like time itself pushing back. I carried it inside without opening it further. Vivian was at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. Roland was there too, as he often was in the mornings, the habit of 40 years of showing up at this farm, having outlasted the formal arrangement that had given it structure. They both looked at the box in my hands, and then at my face, and then at each other. I sat down at the table between them and set the box in the center of it. The lid, now that I could see it properly in the kitchen light, had words scratched into the tin with something sharp, a nail or a knife worked into the metal in the painstaking script of someone doing it letter by letter, slowly with the particular determination of someone who wants to make sure the message survives. Time capsule. Sarah Aldridge. Age 8. Do not open until the year 2000. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth. She stared at the box with the expression of someone who has been surprised in a way that goes deeper than surprise, down into the layer where memory and loss and love have been sitting together for so long that they have become indistinguishable from each other. I remember this, she said. Her voice was soft and full of something I cannot name. She was obsessed with the idea of sending messages to the future. She had read about time capsules in a book, and she talked about nothing else for weeks. She made me help her bury it. She looked up at me with eyes that were bright. She swore me to secrecy, said it was the most important thing she had ever done in her entire life. She buried it under the willow tree, I said, her favorite place in the world. Vivian looked at the box. She used to sit under that tree with books bigger than her head and read all afternoon. She said it was her thinking spot. Her voice was very steady, the steadiness of someone who has had long practice with grief and long practice with gratitude, and has found over time that the two are not opposites, but rather the same response to the same thing depending on the direction you are facing. She buried her most important thing in her most important place. Of course she did. She was 8 years old, and she was completely certain the world made sense. I opened the box. The smell that rose from it was the smell of decades of sealed tin, dry and faintly sweet, the particular preservation of a small enclosed space that had been protected from moisture and temperature change by depth and by the density of the soil above it. Inside, the contents were arranged with the serious organizational care of an 8-year-old who had thought very hard about what belonged in something this important. A small cloth doll with yarn hair gone pale with age and button eyes that had seen everything and said nothing for 33 years. A photograph protected by a piece of wax paper folded around it, showing 3 generations of women on the porch of this farmhouse, all of them looking at the camera with the specific directness of people who are not performing for the lens, but simply being in a moment that someone happened to record. A pressed flower, a wild flower of some kind, the petals reduced by decades to a faint brown tracery against the paper that held them, the structure of them still visible. A small collection of smooth stones from the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. Each one chosen, I was certain, for a specific quality of color or shape that had spoken to a particular child on a particular afternoon. And a letter folded into a precise square in the round, careful handwriting of a child who has been taught penmanship and is applying it with full seriousness to a document she believes matters. I unfolded it. I read it once to myself. Then I looked up at Vivian and Roland and I read it aloud. Dear person who finds this box, my name is Sarah Aldridge. I am 80 years old and I live on a farm in Montana with my mom and my grandma. I am burying this box under my favorite tree, the weeping willow in the front yard, and I am putting in it the things that are most important to me so that the future will know what mattered. When I grow up, I am going to be a veterinarian and take care of all the animals in the world, especially horses and also dogs. I like reading books and swimming in the creek and helping Grandma Vivian make pie crust because she says I have the right hands for it. I like storms as long as I am inside when they happen. If you are reading this, then the year 2000 has come. I hope the future is wonderful. I hope there are good things happening and that people are being kind to each other and that the farm is still here because this farm is the best place in the world and I want it to always be here forever. If you are my son or my daughter or my grandchild, I want you to know something important. I love you even though we have not met yet. I will love you forever no matter what happens, no matter where I am or where you are or what comes between the time I write this and the time you read it. You are going to be wonderful. I already know it. Please take care of this place. It is special because of all the people who have loved it, and the love does not go away. When the people do it, stays in the wood, in the stone, in the old oak trees, and if you are quiet and you pay attention, you can feel it there. All my love forever. Sarah Aldridge, age 8. P.S. The best place to find interesting rocks is in the creek by the big flat stone near the eastern fence. But please don't tell anyone I told you that because it is my secret spot. I put the letter down on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. The winter light came through the windows and lay across the old wood in the particular way it did on these December mornings, low and golden and patient, the light of a season that has made its peace with the brevity of its own days. Vivian was not trying to contain what was on her face, and she was not apologizing for it. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she looked at the letter and she let it do to her what it was going to do, which is the only thing you can do with the things that cost the most. Roland was looking out the window at the bare oak trees and the sky. I picked up the small photograph from the box and held it in both hands. 3 generations of women on this porch. My great-great-grandmother Vivian, at whatever age she had been in that year, younger than I had known her face still carrying something of the fierceness that had sustained everything. Dorothy beside her, a young woman running a farm, the set of her shoulders already carrying more than she would ever talk about. And my mother, 8 years old, standing in front of them both with her gap-toothed smile completely present in a moment she could not have known would need to last for 33 years. They had all loved this place. They had all, in their different ways and at enormous cost, protected it for the one who came after. And here I was. I sat for a while longer at the kitchen table in the farmhouse that was ours again, with the woman who had waited longer than any waiting should ask of anyone, and the man who had tended this place through all the years of its difficulty, and my mother's letter in my hands, and the December light coming through the windows onto the old wood. Then I got up and went to the window and looked out at the front yard, at the stump of the willow tree, at the bare fields running out to the mountains, at the sky above them that went on without limit in every direction. Next spring, I said, we plant a new tree. Something strong, Vivian said from the table. Something that will be here in 100 years, Roland said. I looked at the stump, at the place where the roots had been, at the open ground where something new could grow. Outside the kitchen window, the first snow of winter had begun to fall. Not the tentative, half-hearted snow of early season, but the real thing, steady and unhurried, the kind that means it and knows it and has no particular timeline in mind. It was settling onto the bare branches of the oak trees along the driveway, onto the fields, onto the roof of the farmhouse, covering everything in the particular white that means beginning. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window and looked out at it falling. Mom, I thought, not as a prayer exactly and not as a wish, more as a statement of fact, the way you tell someone something you know they already know, but you need to say out loud anyway because the saying of it is its own kind of keeping. I found it. I found them. I found my way home. The snow kept falling. The kitchen was warm behind me, full of the smell of coffee and old wood, and the specific warmth of a house that has been loved back into itself after a long time of being afraid. And in the quiet of that December morning, in the house that 4 generations of my family had held on to at costs I was only beginning to understand, I could feel all of them present in the way my mother's letter had promised they would be. In the grain of the wood, in the weight of the old keys. In the way the light came through windows that had seen 100 years of mornings and were ready for 100 more. The snow kept falling and I stayed at the window and I let it be exactly what it was.